Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, Archaeosupians, or Rhys here for Archaeo-Scope. Now, today's Archaeo-Scope is going to be about a bit of a heated issue because it's going to be divided on opinion between consulting archaeologists, academic archaeologists, students, volunteers and enthusiasts, which I'm sure we have a plethora of that watch Archaeo-Scope, so it'll be really good to get all the opinions of people to come in on this issue. Now, the issue is volunteering. Now, volunteering, I'm going to define this in a second. Volunteering archaeologists, I don't agree with the current system, and neither do, I would say, 50% of working or consulting archaeologists out there, and I know a lot higher amount of students probably wouldn't agree with the current system. But to define what I'm talking about when I'm talking volunteering, I am not talking about field schools. So I think field schools are a fantastic idea, where predominantly in America, where you get archaeologists that pay maybe $1,000–$2,000 and they go off to places such as Mexico, Texas. I was looking at one in the Caribbean, and basically that $2,000 is there to cover teaching costs. Sometimes it covers their food, sometimes it covers the accommodation. But the idea is that this field school is actually, as you can have guessed, it's a school, and you do get credit points or credits added to your university degree for doing these classes, because number one, it's done in a controlled and structured and formalized environment, usually supported by some sort of an institution or university or college. Now, I think this is a great thing, predominantly because you're not just going out there digging, you're not just going out there and sieving, you're going out there, you're writing reports, you are doing a lot of the academic side that comes with the field work as well, and that is a really important thing. Now, that's not what I'm talking about today. What I am talking about is volunteering on consultant digs, on university funded digs, those kind of excavations. Anyway, I'll start off by saying there are two major views in archaeology on this subject. There's the conservative view and then there's the progressive view. So the conservative view at the moment is that the system should be primarily left how it is, where volunteers come on, apply to go into digs, where they basically, for the large part, cover their own costs by paying for their own transportation, paying for their own food, and paying for their own accommodation in some cases. Now, under normal circumstances, if you're an archaeologist working for a consultancy or a university, all these costs would be factored in to the original report, the desktop assessment. You would say how much money is needed to do this, and then be paid usually for all those external costs. Now, this isn't so with volunteers. Volunteers have to cover all that themselves, and under the majority of cases, volunteers are archaeology students, which are in a lot of cases extremely poor because, number one, they're university students, and we all know university students live off mee goreng and sometimes eggs, and if you're really, really lucky, you can pour some sweet chili sauce on the mee goreng, and you know it has a bit of taste then. But the idea that archaeology students can actually afford to come onto excavations because they're usually missing school, or they're usually missing work, you know, if they're working at McDonald's or something for how much McDonald's pays you these days, you know, it's just a really bad situation for any student to be in. And you would have thought that archaeologists, graduated archaeologists who were in the same situation, would have sympathy for that. Now, this takes me further into the conservative view that, you know, toughen up, children, you know, I did it, I came from the school of hard knocks, this is how it's done. Well, to those people, I say, and the progressive people say, well, just because it is doesn't mean it's right, or doesn't mean it's morally correct. And I think the archaeological community is starting to lean more to this progressive view of volunteering, where volunteers should be, in all cases reimbursed for the costs that they incur to come out and dig sites. And this in a lot of ways has started to happen in Australia. I'm not sure in other parts of the world, but what we're seeing now is it's becoming common practice to basically pay students maybe anywhere between $20 to $100 a day Australian to cover their costs, which I think is a somewhat reasonable thing to do, as long as you have a decent system in place to, pay by the hour or pay by, an 8-hour system block, something like that. Anyway, I'm going to talk about consultancies and universities separately, and basically tell you how the volunteer system works with both of these things. Now, with universities, what usually happens with university-run digs is a professor will have an area of interest where they've all of a sudden accumulated some funding to go out and excavate a site which they are researching. Now, this is fantastic, but the issue is that a lot of universities put, maybe on a wall somewhere or in a university newsletter that they're looking for archaeological volunteers to come and help out on these digs. And for beginners, not all these digs are in the same country that you're going to be in. For example, there's a lot of volunteer digs over in Cyprus that are run from Victorian universities where I live. And that's a great thing, but of course students have to pay for their own plane fares, students have to pay for a lot of the time accommodation and food and all these kind of things. So, and it's not covered by the costs of the dig. Now, I don't agree that students who are coming out to volunteer for a professor's project should be paying for the privilege of doing it, predominantly seeming that a lot of professors, when they are doing these excavations, are not really paying attention to the volunteers who are there to get field experience. And that field experience, right, comes in the form, usually on these digs, of you've got to be sieving for a few hours a day, you're going to be digging for a few hours a day, you're going to be washing artifacts for a few hours a day, those kind of mundane and repetitive tasks. And I can tell you now, you're not going to learn anything by repeating these tasks 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Yes, you'll learn how to clean artifacts really, really well, but that's not going to get you a job, and it's certainly not going to look that good on your CV when somebody goes, how much experience do you have? Now, what I believe should be done in these cases, and so do a lot of other people here, some people I've actually interviewed a couple of archaeologists and a few other friends of mine, what they think on the situation to get a varied amount of views. And one of the systems that we thought of was a passport system, where you would have a passport of some degree or another, where you would have a whole bunch of activities that you need to tick off once you know how to do them. For example, drawing a site plan. Now, myself, I've been volunteering on digs for over 7 years now, and I've been lucky enough to actually have been employed for 3 years casually, and I learned quite a lot of skills. But I only recently, within the last 2 years, learned how to draw a site plan. Now, the 5 years before that, nobody trained me to do that because, number one, they didn't see that as their job. And this is more talking about consultants now, not university digs. Nobody either thought it was their job to teach us. Nobody thought it was probably ethical to let somebody with no experience to do that, which is a whole different argument. And to some degree, I actually agree with that statement. Somebody who doesn't know what they're doing shouldn't necessarily be thrown in the deep end and recording site details in that way, unless of course you've got a senior archaeologist or somebody with more experience looking over your shoulder to say, yes, you're doing this right, or no, you're doing it wrong. Which when I was doing my site plan, I actually had somebody over there. I'm very, very grateful to her, in fact, for looking over my shoulder, because I stuffed up a few times. Myself, I didn't write the context numbers next to the different contexts. I thought that went on a different piece of paper that overlaid, like a transparent piece of paper that overlaid onto the site plan, which that's what I thought, and that was, I suppose, incorrect. But I mean, that just goes to show that, yeah, people need to be looked after in that case. Anyway, so I'm going to talk a bit about consultants now, and this is the majority of where I have my issues with volunteers. Consultancies obviously work for developers. Sometimes they're working for government, sometimes they're working for private interest groups. But for the predominancy of the bread and butter work in the consulting archaeologist field, it's developers that are paying your wage. Now, consultants, before they even stick a shovel in the ground, have to come up with a budget. Now, this budget will have all the costs of the wages of the archaeologist, the costs of equipment, costs of conservation, costs of transportation, costs of hiring excavators, all those, everything goes into the budget. However, the one thing that generally doesn't go into a budget is volunteers, volunteer wages, people. You know, a lot of, and I'm not saying all consultants do this, by the way. I know there's quite a few really good consultancies out there that treat their volunteers with the respect that they deserve. They're not treating them like mud bucket labourers, so to say. But the idea is that consultancies, when they put a budget forward, what can happen is if they do include volunteers in the budget, the developer will give them a certain amount of money to offset the cost of the volunteers. Now, some consultancies, rather than pay the volunteers, keep that money. They keep the money that was possibly meant for the labourers. They also use labourers to undercut other consultancies on jobs. So if you hire, for example, free labour, so let's say we have 5 young budding archaeologists, volunteers who want to come on a dig, and there's 2 different consultancies vying for the same job, what you're going to find is that the person that has the more people that can get it done quicker, which will be in the initial assessment, if I can get it done in 2 weeks and they can get it done in 3, at the same cost, they're going to hire the person who can get it done in 2 weeks. Now, they're not going to be paying their volunteers for the labour that they're doing, even though those volunteers most likely got them that job in a lot of ways. So that is a huge issue within the archaeological communities, consultancies using volunteers to basically cut costs. And in some cases, this will then go into varying standards of archaeology. If you put more volunteers on a dig than you have archaeologists supervising, then the standards of the excavation will drop. Right, anyway, I'll start talking about as far as what I've been talking about with other archaeologists, what can be done. So we've already mentioned the passport system, whereby young archaeologists can go out and basically get ticked off by a senior archaeologist and say, okay, you know how to do these now, go back to university and you'll get some credit points perhaps. That would be a fantastic system. But in saying that, you need to probably, and this is something that's been said by some of my friends, you probably are going to need a formalised agreement between a university and consultants. Now, this formalised agreement would say, okay, the consultants are actually responsible partially for the training of young archaeologists. So that's kind of like a traineeship system where, like I was saying before, with builders and plumbers and that, they go to their TAFE or their technical college school, and they do a lot of, they learn things there, they do their paperwork there. That's like, for archaeologists, that's the university side of things, the academic side. But then when they're actually going out with their trainer, with their builder, they're actually learning on-the-job skills. Now, this should be, I think, the same with archaeologists, where you have consultancies set up with this formalised agreement to basically say, okay, we're going to train you in the practical skills of archaeology, in the field work, in the drawing, with taking field notes, with the information that you need to put in reports. That's all the job of the consultancy, rather than consultants bitching about how you know, oh, we've got raw trained young archaeologists coming out straight from honours, they don't know what they're doing, we're blaming the university for it. Well, instead of blaming the university, maybe they should look at their own responsibilities to actually help out with the training process, so they know by the time young archaeologists start coming out into the field, you know, a newly graduated archaeologist comes out in the field, that they have those skills, you know. I don't think they should be blaming the universities for that. And I think one particular reason for this is, as some of my actual professors have said in an article that's just been released, part of the responsibility for this lies with the university structures that seldom allocate appropriate financial, human and material resources for inherently practical and thus costly subjects such as archaeology. And naturally, the conflicting demand of a general education and specific technical training. Consulting companies, however, are equally culpable, keen to use student volunteers as free or cheap labour, often doing mind-numbing tasks devoid of responsibility, and few contract archaeologists invest adequate time and effort in professional development for their volunteers. Now, that was written by Professor David Thomas, Professor Richard Cosgrove, and Professor David Frankel, who are all professors at La Trobe University, and I think they've really hit the nail on the head with that. And it's really, really good to see senior archaeologists, professors, actually standing up for the rights of volunteers and their students. It's really quite refreshing to get that happening. Now, as they've just said, the amount of resources that actually are able to be put into students at university for archaeology is quite minimal. And they openly state that, and they obviously state that the resources have to be shared around as much as possible, and this usually means that they can't do as much as they like. So that's one thing that could be done: the passport system and a formalised agreement between universities and consultancies to train archaeologists both in and out of the classroom. Now, one other thing that I think should be done, and it's funnily enough, so does the Australian Association of Consulting Archaeologists Incorporated, which is kind of like, I suppose, it's a big group of consulting archaeologists, and they have their own board and they have their own ethics and standards. What they say, and what I think as well, is that there should be a minimal wage for all volunteers, which is basically set at the current minimum wage, whereby I think that would probably equate to about $15 an hour, which $15 Australian an hour would add up to about $13 US an hour, or about £8 an hour in the UK. So what they basically say is that the volunteers should be given a minimum wage, and I'll actually read you exactly what it says in their ethics charter. Training of potential archaeologists. Section 10. A member shall be given less qualified co-workers on a project every reasonable opportunity to gain skills and experience, and shall negotiate adequate and appropriate remuneration for such work with regard to skills of the co-worker and requirements of the job. So that's the first bit about young archaeologists not getting the skills they crave to actually be able to be employable after they finish university. Now, this next bit is section 17, and it's called Duty of the Employees. The recommended fee scales for employees shall be regarded as minimum and shall not be undercut. So there you have that, what I was saying before about undercut. You know, there shouldn't be any undercuts, and there's certainly, you know, minimum wage. You know, it's all written there. However, what we're finding is that archaeologists around Australia, around Victoria, are not adhering to these kind of situation where they're actually treating their volunteers fairly in that sense. And I could run off a whole bunch of names of different consultancies that are good and that aren't so good. And I'm not going to do that for, well, several reasons. Number one, mostly, I think every consultancy should be given the benefit of the doubt and give the benefit to change their ways. And I don't think me bad-mouthing any consultancy, whether it be in Australia or overseas, I don't think that's going to do anyone any good. So I won't be doing that in this video. So anyway, I would like to thank a few people for the information that they've given me, Chelsea, Michael, and a few others. Yeah, I really want to hear what you guys all have to say about this, because it's going to be really interesting, and I really hope that you can help me in understanding other ways of what can be done. You know, how the situation for volunteers can be improved, you know, and not just this old conservative way of thinking, I've come from the school of hard knocks, I didn't get paid, neither should you. That's just not good enough. Anyway guys, third part to historical archaeology coming out very soon. Cheerio.